solid is pulled down, the sacred desecrated, and people stand unsafe, the earth rolling beneath their feet, finally forced to examine their lives living with sober sight. And all of this happens not in one country or two, for an unquenchable urge to sell off the bulging commodities ceaselessly drives the bourgeois class across the whole worldwide expanse of the earth. It must everywhere look around, build upon, settle in, everywhere tie the sticky threads. It makes consumption and production cosmopolitan. It is at home everywhere and nowhere. It destroys the rich crafts and indigenous arts and fetches its raw materials from furthest off places. Its factories serve as passions and needs brought forth by the most diverse plants. High amid clouds, the feverish commodities climb up the mountain paths. They trample on rotting coal bars that have stood for 1,000 years. Their password is cheap! Exclamation mark. And who are the white-bearded geezers there? Priests come to curse the blasphemers? Not a chance. They are buyers. And those walls there have a compliment. The agents smile, and with veils of lightest calico batter soundlessly down the Chinese walls. Mountains make way, islands regroup, people start needing each other. Spiritual wealth, too, becomes a commonwealth of spirit. The Roman scholar avidly reads a formula from Poland. Lines penned by an English hand are completed by a Japanese hand. And together, scholars all over the world design an image of the world. Literatures of various peoples become the world's literature.
Thank you very much. So our session this morning is David Broder, who's going to speak on identity. So we'll be for about 50 minutes, then we'll open up for some questions.
Well, thanks, Jack, and well, thanks Finance University for being dynamics. As I said, I'm going to talk about the way in which the far right parties talk about the working class and the way in which they make class the idea of representing the working class into inflexive parts of the message. So last May, the American pollster Pew found that US Republicans are much more likely to identify as working class than Democrats. So that could be seen to conform to a story you've heard in lots of Western countries, which is that nominally progressive political parties are losing support among blue-collar voters who are instead turning to the nationalism rights for protection. That's a version of the story of Trump or the Brexit vote. The blue-collar voters are rebelling against the left or globalization. But this poll also told us something else about this so-called working class electorate. 62% of Republican voters identify as working class. Yet even in the highest income bracket, among Republican voters earning more than $10,000 a month, 59% identified as working class, almost as many. In the survey, education was a key criterion for class identification. University grads were less likely to call themselves working class. But Republicans who had attended 4 years of university, among that group, still a majority, 51%, identified as working class. So even the richest, highest educated Republican voters think of themselves as working class. We see something quite similar in Britain. In 1997, when he was about to become Deputy Prime Minister, John Prescott said, "We're all middle class now." Tony Blair, as Prime Minister, said, "The class war is over." The New Labour project drew on the idea that the working class was fragmenting and dying, and that middle class values and aspirations should shape the social democratic project. But what happened next defies expectations. One forced march of the industrialization toward trade unionism to bits, the proportion of people who think of themselves as working class as a personal identity, has continued to rise and is much higher now than it was in the early 1980s when it started to be evolved. Routinely, around 60% of people in Britain think of themselves as a party. Yet, in its everyday political uses, into media discussion, sparring, symposium, and so on, working classness is usually politically coded as socially conservative and right-wing. Andy Howden, a former Bank of England official, CEO of the Royal Society of Arts, might sound like someone in an ideal position to define what working class means. He's also an advisor to Keir Starmer's government, and in June he labelled Nigel Farage a tribute to the working class. The BBC or the Guardian would never refer to a tube strike or say something like the protests in France, the strikes against women or nationals mentioned before. They would never say that sort of working class rebellion. Yet they happily and consistently frame movements against green measures, against green taxation, or, for example, things like the riots against migration last summer, or recent protests against migrant hotels, which were consistently presented in terms of working class interests and attitudes, as is the rise of candidates of the type of marine and migration and so on. So in this, I think we can see a symbiosis of claims far right wants to be itself and is portrayed in mainstream media. In May, taking aim at stars like reaching net zero, reducing carbon emissions. Eventually, Farage declared that the former UK was now a real working class Britain. More in common, pollsters carried out a survey which found that UK was the Farage himself is the working class. But actually, he was still the highest rated among the main party leaders for being working class. So 19% of people think that Farage is working class, 17% think that his star, son of a toolmaker, is working class, getting that among the votes. I think the attitudes towards which candidates are working class very closely in line with the preference. Starmer would say he's the son of a toolmaker, or many election candidates who boasted that they had working class ancestors, that their grandfathers were miners and dockers. They want to, often they kind of associate himself with this or that constituency. It's a bit like Paul Mason deciding he wants to run Wales, so he'll put some Welsh language in his Twitter bio. Other candidates they might say, well, I'm going to all the dogs. So they kind of associate themselves with the area, but also with the kind of idea of keeping their vibe as some of women's work, and kind of throwing their own deserved social rights. And this isn't only claimed by politicians or for electoral but it's borne out by studies of the way that more ordinary, less public-facing people talk about their class position. So a recent study found that professionals talking about their class background were far more likely to emphasize blue-collar relatives and irritating relatives necessary to be blue-collar jobs, while extracting information that revealed that they had an easier time of things, or perhaps that their own material status is less individually popular. This kind of way of talking about class as a personal identity, even as something inherited from relatives, is clearly some distance from the way that Marxists talk about class as a collective relational identity. So a collective relation which is grounded in ownership of means of production. Nonetheless, this way of talking about class is also extremely common, and it informs governments think about the choices. especially in the post-2008 period, and long-term contraction of economic growth, it provides a raw material which is well exploited by ruling populist parties. The idea that hard work used to pay, but no longer does, that people are systematically blocked from achieving what their efforts ought to entitle them to, is far from inevitably channeled into socialist or egalitarian ideas, or a reclamation of older welfarist social democratic expectations. Instead, it is usually politicized by right-wing forces as a critique directed against both undeserving elites, professional work, etc., ruling classes, and the feckless scroungers to welfare recipients, students, etc., who are said to be rewarding rather than rewarding the hard-working, honest people. It isn't sort of the gap to right-wing parties have politics promised to protect certain groups of workers and have always been more conservative and less organized parts of the working class. But I think the difference in the period since 2008, amidst the vast decay of social democracy around the West, is the self-presentation of far-right parties as the quintessential natural representation of the working class voice, and their effectiveness in imposing this claim across the media political space, and the hegemony of the claim to be working class, hence you and the other back to the official ruling voice of the workers. Political scientists in economics, Brexit will often complicate the idea that this is just the expression of working class collective decision. So they might say that the fact that centre-left parties can no longer reliably secure the bulk of working class votes hasn't necessarily translated into a median alignment in which there is instead a coherent working class vote for the right. So there are factors as well as fragmentation, the fact that workers are less organised, less involved into dense mass parties, indeed less likely to vote at all. Right? So even if, say, the UK gets 40% vote, or polls at 40% among people who call themselves blue collar workers, once we factor in turnout, we realize that maybe only a quarter of that group actually supports the party. So the idea of letting a coherent working class vote for the UK or something like the National Rally in France and the Independence Party is a bit more complicated. There's not just a realignment to the right, but there's sort of fragmentation of a less collective party vote at all. Still, it is not quite accurate to say that there's a structural working class vote for the former UK National Rally US Republicans. These parties do use the realignment story as an offensive campaign message. The claim to represent the working class is emotionally and politically compelling. It says the message they stand for the hard-working but collective working class, battled on by elites. And the important thing in this is that it's not just about they are rallying behalf of the working class. It's the idea of representing the working class unites groups across different classes. So as in the Republicans I mentioned earlier, even the personally wealthy, even business owners can identify as working class and want to identify their own political preferences with defence of classically working class interests and values. This says not on socialism or generous welfare, but ideas like self-help, fair reward for hard work, and a truer meritocracy, essentialized as typical working class values. It takes up not the call workers of the world unite, but ideas like fair reward for hard work, or even the kind of self-help slogans that used to be painted on even trade union banners in this country. Arne and I were looking recently at a book called Banner of Bright by John Gorman. It's like a history of banner making in British trade union, so directed by Gwyn Williams. So it has stuff like the whole Siemens Union,
Right. And the slogan on it is God helps those who help themselves. Right. So it's not the common sense on which this framework of working class values draws isn't purely artificial or new. It draws on traditions that exist in the non-Marxist currents of the labour movement and, of course, even in the British Labour Party itself, that include like meritocracy. Right, so the idea that released from its initial satirical coinage by Michael Young, but the idea of meritocracy, like the society should be organised in a way that rewards talent and hard work. That idea is not egalitarian, but is a major current in the tradition of the labour movement. So if these are indeed working class values, then things like opposition to green taxes, calls for a harsher discipline of welfare recipients or migrants can be justified on these terms. Even higher earners want to identify their choices as defense of the unprivileged that ever frustrated hard-working people. Through the message, too, working class has a big been represented not only in Marxist and structural accounts, but also in more idealized representations of working people and their values, often stereotyped at the level of personal identity and the hard-working individual. This is classic labourist. So, for instance, in the 1920s, in the UK, working class, there were just as many domestic servants as there were miners. But miners are more likely to appear as abstract representations of the working class. Because militancy and record struggle against the 1926 general strike, but also the collective and productive, socially useful nature of the work, decisive industry, and decisive to train the working class is important to capitalist development. Through the long shutdown of the industry and the defeats of 1984-5 and 1992, the ground was laid for this figure, this representation of the miner, be flipped into its opposite, allowing a Thatcherite like Nigel Farage to both his party, say, the defender of the neglected ex-mining communities, to sort of like Durham, for example. So people in Durham might object, well, actually, is it the ex-miners, is it the ex-NUN members who are voting for Farage? That's hard to judge. But the claims in representing those communities, the idea that entity is now associated with Reform UK, when the party won the local elections there, is very compelling. People could help rally even across class elections. If once the left built an alliance for social democracy, the idealised figure, hard-working, voluntaristic miner, today, UK with the figure left behind and abandoned in order to condemn elites to send ordinary people and construct a cross-class alliance against workers, the federal and imperial class. So what kind of working class actually is this? The right way to assess mobilising working class votes is not seen in terms of suppressing the working classes distinct and separate class interests, so removing the element of class conflict. Often it's imagined that in order to create a working class place, the right is to pose it in terms of nation and race instead, so that the exclusivist terms of a white working class. This is sometimes described in terms of replacing a horizontal split in society, so one between the ruling class at the top and the working class majority beneath, replacing a vertical split that combines different classes but excludes migrants, non-nationals, and so on. So in this account, part of the working class identified with the national community and the solidarity classes within the nation state, within Britishness, but rebel when this solidarity is betrayed by the ruling class, by elites. Notably when they feel sidelined, favour of immigrants or Muslims, and that actually that's external to this community. So I think this becomes insufficient, but I think it's an important way of how this is thought. So I'm going to take the example of
the summer 2024 riots in Britain. So this seems obviously a conflict about national identity threats, where the starting trigger to the street riots and respond was a mass stabbing by the called South of Black immigrants. Who was possibly rumored to be silence. So the riots, in terms of things said at the protests, the targets, Muslims, random people who are immigrants, hotels where scientists are staying, Austin and Austin. The protest took the form of a protest about national identity and race. But the story of the class immediately came to the fore, and perhaps from surprising sources. So the Spectator magazine read several articles relating to the rise of working class protest and the crackdown against it by the Kingstar's government and the display of class hatred. Historian David Broder called this the end of the Labour Party's relationship with the white working class. Conservative pundit Douglas Murray insists that the working class today had no way to express anger or frustration or anything else without being to far grounds. So the few thousand people who took part in the riots were stereotyped as representative of the working class, but silenced oppression. The Telegraph focused on similar. He quoted Mel Stride, who said that the riots showed how working class took white pathways to different society due to the difficulty accessing stable employment or home ownership. So surely anyone would be appalled by the murder which the riots claimed to protest. But even if the arson attacks that followed were deplorable, saying it can't distance itself from violent action, the right-wing politicization brought another story, the betrayal of the social compact on which the working class was relied in order to create an hinterland of legitimate grievance. Murray's comments didn't, though, just racialize the seek to split the working class along racial lines, but rather attributed working classness to the nationalist protest. We see this again with the recent protests of migrant hotels, which were last week. The video on which had a lot of circulation on Twitter, which is like this really party with that counter protest, and she's defending these asylum seekers somewhere to stay, and she's calmly and rationally saying, then a guy comes and gets up in her face and does what's far off the shelter. And in Twitter discussion of this, it's really noted by how much this was reduced to an argument between two different class positions. Right? She is middle class, whereas the person shouting at her is working class. Even if there was no information about who she was, what her job was, whether the aesthetic confrontation was celebrated as working class anger. Anal read one very popular and shared comment, which speculated on the reason that a material basis for why working class people shout. So that, well, probably this guy is angry about asylum hotels, probably he's worked in a factory all his life, and machines are very noisy, so like that's where it's shouting over. It made my myself the same day, and then I was an article about heavy metal also has its origins in industrial work. So there's a parallel. But the point is that this is an attempt to typify anti-immigration sentiment, and it's not driven by hatred or exclusion, but rather through the working class pride being spat upon. So, socialist accounts also see the right of this class in terms of this kind of racialized vertical division within the white working class experiences to make it solidarity the working class against outsiders, migrants, non-nationals. So, basically, last year's riots, Richard Seymour
rightly questioned what evidence there actually was that any of the protesters were working class. Also, if we look at things like January 6th in Washington, very many of the participants who were put on trial and as we found out their jobs seem to be quite an over-representation of lawyers and estate agents rather than the rulers working class participants. But Seymour also said, well, even if these are working class people, then, or indeed the white working class, then the operative term is whiteness. The thing they're protesting against is their lost wages of whiteness, their superior ethnic standing. There was an interesting response to him by Anton Jaeger in the New Left Review, who agreed that, okay, so these protests, these riots, they're not kind of really about jobs and services. They're not really about economic issues. But even so, it was necessary to understand them in the context of the regions where they took place and the effects of austerity. And Jaeger's point was, well, if you don't understand it in terms of this backdrop of deprivation, which causes the alienation, which causes the antisocial behavior, if you don't recognize it as an effect of deprivation, then how do you go about changing? So a sort of left-wing redemptive story of how to, why this happened and how to overcome it, in his view, kind of relied on the idea that the people who are protesting are kind of victims of austerity. And I think that this approach is really wrong and actually plays into the way that the far right is constructing its idea of the working class in terms of neglect, the left behind, and so on. And that this isn't a realistic picture of who is voting for these parties. In fact, as they become more successful, we see that their electorate is becoming more cross-class, less reduced to marginal groups, people living in small towns, people on low incomes. If we look at, say, National Rally or Reform UK, as their vote grows, their vote is becoming relatively more middle class. But they still use the language of speaking for the working class. One of the kind of analytical versions of the idea that these parties represent the left behind, the working class, relies on the language of welfare chauvinism, right? So this is a term used by political scientists and sociologists, welfare chauvinism, which is that these parties are about defending the old welfare state, the gains of social democracy, but protecting them only for nationals and excluding immigrants from them. So maybe schools and hospitals are good things, maybe welfare benefits are good things, but the cash for them is under pressure, and it's important to stop them being overwhelmed by migrants who come and then demand these services. But this idea of the reasons why working class people support these parties, I think, is reductive and exaggerates working class people's commitment to welfarist ideology. So when Giorgia Meloni's it's in effect, it's a left-wing framing which conveys the idea that these people would vote for the left if only the correct welfare were offered to them, which I think is not true. When Giorgia Meloni's government in Italy got rid of unemployment benefits a few months after being elected, it was in early 2023, Giorgia Meloni's government in Italy, Fratelli d'Italia, they got rid of the thing called citizens' income, earlier introduced by the Five Star Movement, which was like a €500 a month benefit for people on very low incomes, the unemployed. And I had a journalist from Politico, liberal Brussels European Politics magazine, and she asked me, like, well, why on earth would Meloni get rid of the very thing that her base want? Right? Why would a right-wing politician, a populist, get rid of welfare benefits? I think there's a certain kind of like liberal elitist idea, which is like, there's a thing called populist economics, and what it relies on is like handouts. But the opposite is true. Right? Meloni had consistently opposed the introduction of welfare benefits, opposed it throughout the period of Parliament. Her party was the only party that consistently opposed it. She promised in the election to get rid of unemployment benefits, and then did so. the way that her political camp talks about work is not, let's have more handouts for the Italians and not migrants. It's steeped in ideas of meritocracy, right? There's the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. There are deserving elites and undeserving elites. There are hard workers and slackers. It's telling also in this sense that her party changed the name of the Education Ministry to the Ministry of Education and Merit. Right? So what it's talking about, what it's appealing to, the raw material with which it works, is an already existing expectation of meritocracy, but that is somehow frustrated and which it promises to make amends for, which it promises to make work. And one of the ways of doing that is by stopping giving handouts to unemployed people, which is also a really great way of driving them into the workforce, even on the lowest of wages, particularly in a country like Italy, which doesn't have a minimum wage, which her party also opposes. So evidently the language of meritocracy isn't new or inherently far right, anything but. Faced with the decline of many traditional industrial jobs and the rise of the so-called knowledge economy, Labour and socialist parties around the West then further into the idea of education as the path to social mobility, understood as a good, and social mobility itself being understood as a good itself. Right? So Tony Blair said, "We are meritocrats." Right? He wasn't, he probably hadn't read Michael Young's book, but he was thinking, well, meritocracy, that's good. People who are talented and work hard should be rewarded. So in some countries, including Germany, where there's a extensive of vocational training, this term associated merit with educational credentials as a path to success in the labour market. This meritocracy is not egalitarian either in intention or in effect. Basically, meritocracy promises to reshuffle the social pyramid in function of talent, effort, achievement, rewarding hard work. But this is vulnerable to two types of challenge, reason why it's not been the basis for long-term success of social democratic parties who invested in mass education, mass higher education. The first is that even if social mobility is not literally a zero-sum game, right? In an expanding growing capitalist economy, it's possible that social mobility will benefit large numbers of people, not directly to the detriment of others. But it directs public action, government intervention, not towards creating the best services, the best living conditions for all, but rather to rewarding individuals. It habitually creates hubs, so-called hubs of excellence. So it creates centers of opportunity for some, while leaving others to manage to decline, including in the education system, including quite literally in school areas that are abandoned, allowed to rot. Insofar as the state takes on a role as arbiter of achievement and opportunity, it easily becomes the target for claims of injustice, unfair treatment, and so on. But there's also a second type of challenge to this model, which is the values on which the selection is based, and even the so-called power of education. These draw the justified popular skepticism. This is really well addressed in a book by Dan Evans called Nation of Shopkeepers. So I'm not really able to do justice to his account here, and actually his argument's quite different to mine. His idea is basically that today we see, his argument is basically the left has underestimated the importance of the petty bourgeoisie. The middle class is too focused on the polarization of ruling and working class, and hasn't noticed that politics today is shaped by the competition between two rival wings of the petty bourgeoisie. One is the highly educated, those who've been but downwardly mobile, so those who've been labeled the disgruntled winners of globalization. So progressive, highly educated people who feel unfairly rewarded on the job market, right? They believed in education achievement as a path to reward success, and they're not getting it in practice. As against this, Evans recounts, there's those who didn't put their efforts into educational achievement, who haven't based their careers on the idea of high qualifications, but who instead have been materially rewarded. So to put this very schematically and crudely by means of stereotype, if we imagine the relative social positions of someone who leaves their hometown to go to a posh university and gets a humanities degree, but isn't able to get a well-paid job and works in a low-paid services job, and then someone who didn't go to university and is a plumber, right? So the plumber might be probably would be like better paid, have higher income, but hasn't bet their fate on this education-centered model of meritocracy. So in Evan's account, there's a kind of conflict between this group, which also explains the weak success of so-called millennial socialism. Basically, downwardly mobile grads in urban centers have turned towards the political left, even to the language of the labor movement and socialism. And this produces a kind of backlash among people who think of themselves as, my plumber, for example, this idea of self-reliant, hard-working people who think that universities are a bit of a con, and that people who invested too much money in them, including the government invested too much money in them, they've been had, but it's their own fault. And I think this element of the working class, those who see themselves as self-reliant, getting ahead, as people who didn't rely on the educational model of meritocracy, these people seem to be an important part of the working class base of far-right parties. Right? Obviously not all of them. Obviously, I'm talking about the minorities who actually vote and participate. But it's not just the left behind, the neglected, the abandoned. It's also people who are materially successful and upwardly mobile. This has been well illustrated in sociological studies of the vote for Marine Le Pen's party. So in a recent book on the vote for her national rally in southeastern France, in a relatively wealthy region, sociologist Félicien Faury tries to discern the priorities of working people who cast a ballot for this party national rally. So they're not political activists. They might think of themselves as particularly invested in politics or ideological, and their past voting behavior might be mixed. Faury draws on the historian E.P. Thompson's idea of a moral economy, the kind of common sense notions of justice and economic justice that inform political action, to try and explain why these people are voting for this party. His interviewees often voice the idea that hard work is a good thing, but isn't rewarded justly. It draws on nostalgia for parts of post-war social compact, but in particular, the language of working class respectability and aspiration. The voters he's talking to are mostly employed in stable working class jobs. So for instance, things like firemen, low-ranking civil servants, jobs with permanent contracts, or run small businesses. They're not the poorest of the poor, but do express anxieties about the pressures on their position and on their mobility, also in terms of things like using petrol cars. The anxieties they express are often stated in terms of class, but not in an anti-capitalist or collectivist sense. So it's often stated in terms like, we're doing well enough that we get nothing from the state. So referring to the fact that other people, the lower ranks of the working class might be getting benefits, other people might be getting tax relief, but these people are lazy, whereas the hard-working, ordinary working class people are suffering. So it's an attitude directed both against the lower ranks of the working class, but also against the people seen as the ones letting them get away with it, the liberal, progressive, higher educated elites who are in charge of the state. So this moral economy, to use E.P. Thompson's term, concerns economic issues, the values of hard work. But these voters say that they're disfavored compared to people who aren't hardworking. They're not anti-statist, but they doubt that they can rely on public services, and especially a public school system, which elites avoid using. So one of the ways in which they experience social relegation, even if they're becoming new homeowners, even if they're earning more, might be, I have to send my kid to a school where there are many young Muslim kids who can't speak French, and the upper middle classes will never want their own kids to study it. So these working class voters are distrustful of welfarism and what they see as the culture of handouts that allows others to free ride and doesn't reward their own hard work. They're strongly imbued by the idea of meritocracy and the belief that it doesn't exist in practice. They bristle at the arrogance of the highly educated and the excesses of the super rich, but not at entrepreneurial values per se. And what he's talking about is the way in which so-called working class values or ideas of success may identify working class voters with certain types of elite and not others. So to put it very schematically, a person in a blue-collar job might be more likely to see Nigel Farage as working class than someone who, even is a city trader, than someone who's like a PhD student. Because the idea of entrepreneurial success is culturally closer to them than the idea of, doing a PhD about, the micro ins and outs of the Italian Communist Party in the 1940s, for example. Right. So obviously, speaking now, I'm very aware that each time I mention the word class, there are probably people in the room thinking David Broder is not working. So I'm going to have to deal with that. But these people see their politics, their political choices in terms of their class position, but not in a sort of broadly solidaristic way. So in short, major sections of the working class favor this party because they see doing so as in their material interest. It's not just that, like in Thomas Frank's account, in his What's the Matter with Kansas, it's not like, oh, they used to vote for economic issues, but now they vote on culture wars instead. That they used to vote about class, and now they vote about identity politics. It's that those things are fused and politicized in the right-wing way. Their experience with the withering of the left and organized labor may have trained them in the understanding that it's more realistic to defend the position they've gained as individuals than invest their hopes in some sort of broad movement for social change or socialist overhaul. So for example, there's a book by Violaine Girard, which is called Le Vote et fait au village, the National Rally Vote in the Village, which is focused on the idea that it's focused on working class people in skilled jobs in peri-urban industrial estates, but who are new homeowners and are basically organizing to, as they say, protect their town from having social housing put there. Right? They don't want welfare recipients, they want immigrants to be moved in with them because they see that as undermining their respectable working class position. Okay, so the basic story I'm telling is right-wing parties rally a structurally cross-class electorate by claiming that these are the hard-working parts of society whose bootstrap spirit makes them working class, while the overeducated elites are middle class and frustrate working class progress through green taxes that undermine jobs, overspending on their pet cultural projects, and the unfair promotion of ethnic minorities, including through affirmative action. The moral economy of work on which they rely, the supposed working class values of self-reliance and reward for hard work, are not new, but are crucial for creating a cross-class alliance for parties like Trump's Republicans, National Rally, and Reform UK. This is directed towards disciplining migrants, but isn't reducible to a purely exclusivist racism that can include whites only. US Republican pollster Patrick Ruffini makes an interesting argument about this in his book, Party of the People Inside the Multiracial Populist Coalition Remaking the GOP, the Republicans. It defines the working class in terms of not having university qualifications. So this is certainly a contentious way of defining class, right? Working class people are just those who haven't finished university, but one often used by pollsters, and which itself advances a certain political vision of what working classness is. But while we could certainly argue with his presentation of what the working class is, he's also exposing a deeper reality, which is that even though we might think about US politics as increasingly defined by racial identity politics and racial polarization, in fact, the way in which different ethnic minority groups vote is ever more defined by the question of college education or not, and not by the pure fact of belonging to an ethnic minority. So just as there used to be a solidly democratic vote among Irish Americans, which no longer exists, the Hispanic and Black vote for the Democrats is becoming much less unanimous than it used to be, right? So even though we might think, well, Trump is the embodiment of like white backlash, in fact, his vote among Black and Hispanic voters is rising and better than previous Republican candidates for some decades. So this is also where we have Republican politicians like Marco Rubio talking about Republicans as the new multiracial working class party. It's its support for low taxes, the gospel of job creation by getting rid of regulation. These kind of things embody a collective interest that include parts of the working class and more middle class groups and business owners, but in the language of supporting working class Americans. This right-wing capturing of class is certainly a major challenge to left-wing parties. Often it's been achieved in the face of parties like New Labour, France's Socialist Party, and so on, who themselves basically chose to stop talking about working class interest. Right? It was easy for these right-wing parties to capture this language, this terrain, because the former supposed representatives of working class interest abandoned the fight. Yet, because of its artificiality, because of its partial representation of the working class, because these parties actually don't have solutions to giving most people a better life, this situation isn't inevitable or insurmountable. It can be overcome through political organizing. Looking at the new left-wing party promised by Zara Sultana and Jeremy Corbyn, it's very easy to imagine that this is going to be cast in mainstream media as a party of middle-class discontent, of lovies, of do-gooders, a party out of touch with the working class. And this will negatively impact its public image. That's a given. That's certainly going to happen. So the question is how to go about overcoming it. And clearly, I think that can't just be resolved by a kind of counter identity politics. But I think it is important to think about the way in which this party, if it does develop, does exist, does become viable, how it can start to reclaim the language of working class representation. So things like, well, Nigel Farage isn't really working class, so let's put forward more candidates with working class accents and backgrounds and so on. Right, that's clearly at most a very small part of the solution. But I think we have to look instead at a more structural problem, right? When the right-wing parties are able to mobilize this working class identity, people sense themselves working class, it does so not at the level of collective mobilization, but a mass of the individuals who think of themselves as frustrated and underprivileged. The response to that, in terms of the social makeup of the left, I think can't be to kind of respond within the media sphere by boasting like, no, we really have working class people's interests at heart. It has to be based on rebuilding the working class as an organized political subject and of building this party's presence, not just in electoral campaigning or media, but rebuilding social infrastructure which identifies left-wing politics with presence in working class everyday life. So not just social movements or political campaigning, as well as elections, but actually things like social clubs, advice centres, libraries, the list could go on. The kind of things which historically left-wing parties and workers' parties have used to embed themselves in working class life. We will never manage to sell a solidaristic message in a society which is itself purely atomized, or by sending messages to people sat at home on their phones. Clearly, we're not going to recreate the world of the 1920s in which, in order to, the way of building those institutions obviously differs from historical experience in terms of the media people consume, their expectations, and so on. But I think that that's a really important task that we have to think about, which is not just to create the party that has the nicest promises or the best program or the best media performers, but one which repoliticizes the experience of class in a collective way at a local and grassroots level. Of course, that's an absolutely enormous task, but sadly, since I'm running out of time, I won't be able to elaborate more on exactly how that should be done.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. So we've got about an hour for questions and discussion. We'll finish promptly at 12 because we've got a tribute at 12. Tina?
Yeah, thanks. It was very interesting, David. I think it's especially the last bit that which has quite concrete applications for us. The Corbyn party, which will, I suspect, take up a lot of our thinking in the next period, as it should. 600,000 people. Caveats with it, obviously. Will they stay? What are they signing up to? Will they actually pay money, etc. But even if it's 50,000, that still is, bigger than anything we've seen for a long time of people who come into politics. Some come back into politics, so they will be looking for answers. And this is a good argument you're giving us to argue against the kind of plans that are currently being made for a federal loose outfit with e-voting. The more you listen to James Schneider, Jeremy Corbyn, you think, oh my God, it's going to be, you can see it now, you're going to have 100 people in a room somewhere in London, which includes all the ones with the suits, the MPs, the councillors, the leaders of this and that. And then at home you have tens of thousands of people who are supposed to click on a button voting for, is it going to be called Left Party? Is it going to be called Left Party with bells on? That kind of stuff, that kind of democracy, which is utterly useless when it comes to our task at hand, which is, obviously we're fighting for a communist future, but also in the here and now we have to organize, we have to collectively get our shit together and talk to each other and build up that collectivity which we've lost around, being of a working class and having a working class identity and working class, the understanding of the working class as the most powerful class in society that can change things. And there's none of us at the moment. And plans like that to atomize us further by e-voting are going in the opposite direction. So that to understand that the right is using working class identity, collectivity, and we're not, is an important argument to make. So that's useful for us. And in terms of the how you define working class, there's lots of different, and we'll hear lots of different definitions, no doubt, in the development of the Corbyn party. I do like Mike's definition in revolutionary strategy. I think that is spot on. It's not just everybody who has to sell their naval power directly, but everybody who's reliant on it, reliant on the wage fund. That includes the mums at home, that includes the students, the kids, that includes the pensioners, that includes people who don't work. This is which makes it all the more important to move beyond the idea of simple workplace organization. But we need district organization. We need the Corbyn party, whatever it's going to turn out, and our own Communist Party as well, which we have to carry on building as well. But there will be tensions in the Corbyn party that will, I suspect, blow it apart before long. But we have to use this opportunity to build our own communist forces as well. But, you know, we have to build branches. We have to not wait for Jeremy Corbyn to tell us, oh, you know what, there's not going to be any branches, because, you know, it's just not possible. Too many people, there's too much of this, which just looks like the way it's going. But there are branches that are being set up right now. People doing it, you know, not waiting for Corbyn to say what we're allowed to do and what we're not allowed to do. And I think we should replicate that everywhere. Just get together with people. You know, build WhatsApp groups and set up a first meeting and say, well, we already have a branch in Sheffield and wherever, you know, London, South, wherever. And, you know, join us. We're organizing collectively. We are actually interested in building a party that's, you know, our party, and not waiting for the Messiah to tell us how to do it and what to do. So it's a useful, you know, historically, but also useful in terms of concrete application in here and now.
Bob?
Yeah, thank you, David. I enjoyed your opening discussion. Very specifically, I just want to make a couple of comments. Question you're talking about the identity, or its identity in association with right-wing organisations. I go to Spain quite a lot, and I have been over the last year or so. Increase in farming competition.
Something I will ask of you. He's a member of an organisation called Citizens, which is public conservative, and a Catholic organisation. And it is pushing around, it's claiming to represent working class interests in Spain, and it's preying, I think, on 40 to 50% of the population there, which live under very precarious working conditions, temporary contract, part-time working, no security, long hours, self-employment, etc., despite state quite relatively strong economic growth at the moment. So playing on people's fear, like, and on people's distrust of the failures of the Spanish government, and it's working. Vox has increased from when it first set up from 10%, so now it's running around 15 to 60% total vote. So it's becoming a threat. And it's from those many members of the working class who are actually
precarious working conditions in society. There's an image, the left has been put out this image of called Thatcher Pobre, which means poor fascists. It's a caricature, and they've got these images of these quite stumpy, overweight individuals who consume a lot of alcohol, they smoke a lot. There's always this image behind them of the Spanish flag,
and there's always some sort of symbolic
representation of religion. And these individuals are often treated as right-wing traders, defending the rich, and they support the rich because they believe the rich and the powerful in society will deliver for them. So they're quite alienated from their working class comrades and citizens, and they're quite they have a dislike for their working class citizens. And given the world situation, I think it's going to get worse over the next few years. I mean, I think Spain's soft social democracy that's being pushed by the Spanish government, the Spanish Socialist Worker Party government, and its left-wing coalition partner, Sumar, it's a soft-wing organisation, I don't think has the power or the ideological conviction to deliver the alternative that you hinted about and you spoke about, you know, to push a positive immigration perspective, to provide necessary funding for social means, to counter the growth in nationalism in Spain. I think the party there is isolated not only in Europe, but throughout the world as well. It's got no strong partnerships or partners or alliances it can cohere. And yes, under these circumstances, I think the situation will get worse, not only in Spain, but in Europe and the world generally.
Ian Smith from CTV. Just wondering a couple of comments about Durham. I live in a former pit village about 6 miles outside of the city of Durham. Durham County Council is now reformed, and there's only about 4 Labour seats on there, which had previously been sort of for decades and decades in the Labour Council. It's tempting to think of it as a reaction against the Labour Party, the reform surge, as it were, but Labour had lost the council at the election before. And what you actually had was a sort of a ragbag of independents, some of whom were previously Labour, but either didn't get selected or had fallen out one way or another with the Labour Party or had become distanced from the Labour Party. So they were either independents or they were Tories or they were Liberal Democrats. And if you look at the reform councillors as well, a lot of them are completely new to any kind of political activity. Quite interesting. And it was also interesting about the kind of spread of them in general. The North East as a whole, and County Durham, which I know better, has had really quite variable results since the miners' strike. Seaham, for example, which had 3 pits at one point, has managed to kind of reinvent itself reasonably well, and has got industrial enterprise parks, which employs quite a few people. And if you go into Seaham, you get a feeling of prosperity, sort of bars and bistros and what have you along the seafront, and it's quite just a few miles along the coast in Easington, it's a ghost town. It's certainly in terms of the high street and that kind of thing. So you see quite a huge disparity taking place. In Durham overall, County Durham, I would imagine still probably the biggest employer is probably the NHS, but you've also got Nissan, for example, not far away from the outskirts of Sunderland. Mention the word Sunderland, you also have to mention the word Brexit. And reform has, of course, been tied up with people who probably Brexit supporting. Some of them famously have very high turnout for Brexit. What was also interesting, of course, was the Miners' Gala, which took place shortly after the election. And so for the first time, you had potentially a council which was hostile to the Miners' Gala. The Miners' Gala had a huge turnout this year, not least of which very favourable weather. Historically, the leader of the council would address the Miners' Gala. The Durham Miners Association was having nothing to do with reform. Council leader addressing the Miners' Gala. Let's also remember as well the part played by sort of workerism on the Labour left. And this is an interesting feature because I was a member of the Labour Party in County Durham as a sort of typical kind of £3 Corbynista. I paid the £3, and then when he got elected, I joined. The most workerists were interestingly probably the most hostile to the Corbyn project. And of course, we also have to remember, I did quite a lot of work with the People's Bookshop in Durham, and that which is a kind of little centre for the left in County Durham as a whole. And you still encounter quite a lot of people who get a bit dewy-eyed about Tony Benn and the Labour left. And that still commands quite a bit of currency, and I would imagine there will be an opportunity really to help kind of develop something with a new kind of left project. But having said that, I'm not immediately optimistic that that kind of seize the heights with regard to County Durham, because reform at the moment haven't had enough time to disgrace themselves. It will come, and quite a few places already they're starting to cut budgets and starting to look at privatising things and that kind of stuff. So the reform honeymoon won't last long. But that doesn't mean to say it won't do quite a bit of damage in the meantime. When I was a member of the Labour Party in County Durham, it was noticeable. I mean, I know from my mum, who was from Seaham herself, it was almost a kind of a tribal affiliation, and it was rooted very much in the idea of a manual working class, and it was very much this sort of workerist kind of stuff. But you do kind of notice the paradox on the Miners' Gala, where you've still got banners, kind of Marx and Lenin, but at the same time, a sizable proportion of the people there must have voted for reform. And I don't believe for one moment they did so because they're fascist, or because there was a great deal of hostility to all political parties, and it was almost a way of saying arseholes to a lot of you, really. But we'll see, and I'm actually quite optimistic about what might come out of future developments. Just also mentioning Palestine solidarity. Of course, there was a Palestine speaker at the Miners' Gala. And there was some question about, well, why are we talking about that? Why aren't we talking about wages? Why aren't we talking about the kind of typical economistic sort of stuff in kind of social media posts and that kind of thing? At the same time, there were quite a lot of people who are very active supporters of Palestine solidarity and celebrated the fact that here for the first time, Palestine solidarity speaker who was an honoured guest of the Durham Miners' Gala. And that was a huge step forward, and on the day received a huge amount of support from the people who were at the gala. So just a few observations. Yeah, that's it for County Durham.
Thanks, David, for a very interesting and stimulating introduction. I agree with you quite strongly about that this is not to be explained primarily by racism, and it's not to be explained equally primarily by decline and left behind. Because if we think about it, just look back and remember the history of Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech and the mobilization of a section of dock workers in support of that, at a time when you are absolutely the reverse of decline, Notting Hill riots, and go back, push further back, and we've got the Tory party organising, rioting against French emigres, against the Irish in the 19th century, against French emigres in the 1790s, against the naturalization of the Jews in the 1750s, against Portuguese Jewish immigration in the 1730s, against dissenting meeting houses in 1710 through 1714, against Huguenot refugees in the 1680s. This is one of the historic lines of capital, which is to organise support behind itself around a sort of idea of it's an anti-elitism, an anti-liberal elite. This anti-liberal elitism is a form of Toryism that goes a long way back. And in fact, the stuff which you're describing is more explicitly is the politics of Luger's Christian Social Party in Vienna in the 1880s, and of the Vatican's European-wide anti-Semitic campaign, which then images productive industrial capital as meritorious and unproductive non-industrial capital as unmeritorious. We can't use the figure of the Jew for this this iteration of it, because the United States' commitment to the emancipation of the Jews in the form of the state, that Zionism is the only road to the emancipation of the Jews, and that therefore all sorts of opposition has to be characterized as anti-Semitic, means that we can't use the figure of the Jew as the figure of unproductive capital, and instead we use the figure of finance, not exactly of finance capital, but of state-related, and of the educated are placed in the role of the Jew in this construction. Second observation on this, the representation is that the story is a narrative of state subsidy going to the undeserving poor, and state subsidy going to the undeserving middle class in the form of education and so on and so forth. But the reality is actually that if we think about guys who are building tradesmen, for example, where's the demand going to come from? And the answer is that demand comes from the subsidies. That in the absence of mass industrial employment, the people who are being the payment to these guys is coming from subsidized building projects for local authority housing. It's coming from repair and upgrading operations and so on and so forth. But equally, it's coming from the employed middle class, which is approximately 37%, 38%, either skilled working / employed middle, add those two together, it's about 37, 38% of population. This class is subsidized. It was subsidized in the form of mortgage interest relief at source until I can't remember exactly when mortgage interest relief was abolished. And then as soon as they abolished mortgage interest relief, they also abolished regular rate revaluation, so that we get a subsidy to the homeowner in the form of the rates are held down, and a lot of the functions of local government, which were paid for by property taxation, are placed on the general taxpayer. Yeah. And a whole load of other aspects. So that, and it's a point which was made back in relation to the Bush administration by a publication called The Economist's Voice, which was published out of Berkeley. Yeah. It turned out that the Republican voting constituencies which campaigned against subsidies and for rewards to work and so on and so forth were massively subsidized by the United States state, either because they were places where military facilities and arms industries were located, or because they were subsidized in the form of agricultural subsidy. And the same is true of this is the untold story, and the story which the Labour Party and indeed the Corbynites won't tell, is that the economy of the British economy is entirely dominated, the American economy are entirely dominated by complex cross-subsidy mechanisms. There is no free market. None of us live in a free market. This is not a free market economy or anything remotely like a free market economy. It's a complex state capitalist, elaborated state capitalist structure with subsidies directed to mass social groups, including to this group who are imagining that the subsidies are going to somebody else other than them. And the third side of that, which relates back to your final story, is yes, we need to reconstruct trades councils, trades and labour clubs, libraries, collective social provision and so on and so forth, quite a lot of which, used to exist but was taken over by the state. And now the state cuts the funds which were previously available, which were previously constructed by working class subscriptions. But the reality, we can't do that well, the two things, one of which we need is we desperately need a property price crash and the end of agricultural subsidy. We need to be willing to campaign for the repeal of the Corn Laws, which means the end of agricultural subsidy. Because by doing that, you drive down property prices. By driving down property prices, you make it possible for workers' collective organisations to get premises for social clubs and for so on and so forth. But also, and that, okay, we're not going to get that because it's, the state is institutionally committed to the property price bubble, and that's true in the States as well as here. But secondly, we need political. We need. Oh God, there's a book, Working Men's Guardians, about the development of the working class press in the 19th century. We need the political in order for the collective in the form of social clubs, etc., not to be simply captured by the right, which is in essence, these institutions were created, they were captured by the social democratic right, and then the social democratic right sells them off. That's essentially what happened. We need that independence of political voice. And actually, that's paradox, because if we say we counterpose to the Corbyn movement is looking about manipulating the bourgeois press, which of course won't work. Cleverness in manipulating the bourgeois press will allow us to do effective politics. We need our own press, and we need our own party as a political party, and not just to say we want to rebuild, simply because in order to rebuild at the grassroots, we need Chartism, as it were. Or not Chartism as such, but we need that context of political opposition. And similarly, other side of that, we need a politics of class, which is a politics of explicit discrimination against the ruling class. In the form of explicit discrimination, the open recognition that the institutions of advertising funded media, private lobbying industry, free market in legal services, etc., are all forms of institutional corruption. We need to be anti, not a class collaborationism, which is social democratic class collaborationism, but an explicitly anti-ruling class discriminatory policy. That's me.
It's already been mentioned that the working class is a class in itself, objectively speaking, because it can only sell its labor power. It has nothing to sell except its labor power. But class consciousness is the class advancing its understanding of for itself, the class for itself. I would look at the history of this. The lumpen proletariat, or the proletariat that vote for the far right and fascist parties, and that has an illuminating history. The Nazi Party was the German Socialist Workers' Party, the German National Socialist Workers' Party. In the south of Germany, which tended to be more Catholic, and in Austria, it was anti-Semitic because the Jews murdered Jesus, didn't they? But in the north of Germany, it was more complicated. This tended to be more Protestant and more secular, and you had the Strasserite movement. Now, the Strasserite movement, Otto and Gregor Strasser, well, they said, well, what is wrong with capitalism? It's finance capitalism that's the problem with capitalism. Finance capitalism is the main problem. And Lenin did say something similar like that, finance capital dominated. But then came the argument, well, who controls finance capitalism? It's the Jews. And we have to get rid of the Jews, we have to get rid of finance capitalism. And then the argument went, we can have the second revolution for socialism. And that was the line of the Strasserites, and it also was the line of Ernst Röhm and the Brown shirts. Now, when Hitler came to power, he consolidated his rule after 53 days with the Enabling Act. The trade union bureaucracy who had gone along with him and in May Day and all that, and cheered him when he said he was on the side of the workers. They never made it home after the May Day meeting. They were put in the concentration camps. As what I mentioned, the Communist Party, who at the time said, well, after Hitler, us, right? Well, they stopped saying that very quickly after they were banged up in the concentration camps. But the point I'm making about it is that even today there are those who are saying that in the USA, for instance, that we could do a version of that after we get rid of the deep state and all that thing, then we can have our socialism. Then we can but it's no good going down that road. I would mention that a week ago today, there was the Troublemakers at Work conference in Manchester. And that Troublemakers at Work conference, I think, is a genuine grassroots movement against the trade union bureaucracy, somewhat like the grassroots left that was led by Jerry Hicks back in the day, which did bring together militants from the Socialist Workers' Party and the Socialist Party and very many others. Because it was directed against the trade union bureaucracy. But now we have a situation where the Labour grassroots, the Red Wall constituencies that vote for the far right, or did vote for the far right, these constituencies were reacting against Labour councils who had imposed austerity without any attempt to fight it, like you had from Liverpool and Lambeth back in the day. No attempt whatsoever. So those red wall states can only be taken back by a proper militant fight from below. And also, I'd finish with this. There is the question that we should thank David Broder for the work he did with Soldat, Arbeiter und Soldat, pointing out what in 43 and 44 in the west of France, the Trotskyist movement there produced Arbeiter und Soldat, appeling to the German army, to the workers in the German army, and of course they were executed as he recalled. But it was in sharp contrast, of course, to the position of the Communist Party. The Communist Party at the time went along with the Popular Front, and they were all for the democratic. And Maurice Thorez, who was the leader of the Communist Party, actually went along with the slogan, "Everyone must kill a Kraut." So the sharp differences between the revolutionary Trotskyism at the time and the class collaboration popular fronts of the Stalinists was never clearer. Thank you.
We say something a bit similar to Ian. 20 now, from Tiso, which is the Middlesbrough kind of red area, and it's an area that covers about sort of 6 parliamentary constituencies. And in the last 2019, very working class, a traditional working class area, lots of heavy industry. but they all went to the Tories in the last election, a part of the Blue Wall. No, they didn't all. Middlesbrough stayed Labour. But in the mayoral election that came just afterwards, the Tories got 76% of the vote, and the vote went up. It wasn't a low turnout. And it was an interesting phenomenon. There was at the time, like a lot of the remaining industrial workers in the chemical class, which is a high concentration of well-paid industrial workers, they welcomed Boris. And there was images in the press of "We love Boris," and he was almost seen as some kind of icon. And similar with Nigel Farage. And I can think in some of these areas, sort of class identity comes in a very odd way. It's like somebody famous is on the telly's coming to talk on our behalf, and so on. And so yes, and at the time, the propaganda from the Tories looked very much like the Labour Party. It was all about industry. It was like, you know, working class subject people, industrial workers in their propaganda, very different. And I actually thought at the time they might adopt something of a social democratic party. But I think part of the thing is, as well, is like a lot of left activists, certainly in the recent period, when they become educated or they get a certain job, they adopt, you know, it's called more middle class attitude, certainly around identity politics. I can remember, for example, I had a job working with homeless young people in London, and very much sort of a layer above homeless young people, and you've had to enforce certain behaviour. And I remember one colleague, a very working class woman from Derby, takes something, "You can't say that." And I think it's the absence of a class movement and class politics that leads many of us, in many respects, to adopt that kind of middle class outlook ourselves without realising it. And that's, you know, a product that comes out of defeat, I guess. And I think just generally just stuff about, well, a lot of people, you know, they talk about like working class subjectivity as equating to being poor. And that's a new thing, you know, like working class subjectivity in a previous era was something like very different fields. We're talking about like the printers and the miners, like in past generations. I knew people who were printers like solidly organised. They earned a packet and they had a very proletarian culture. You know, they'd be just putting 50 quid on horses and stuff like that, but like solidly union, solidly working class, but loaded, you know. And that's not the case. And certainly in areas like Tisa and the Durham, just those workers have had those banners, "We love Boris." And I put it on the Weekly Worker Facebook group under second below post. There's a picture of a load of industrial workers with "We love Boris" placard. They, in another instance, they stopped the motorway on several on taking like non-strike industrial action to answer their grievances. They had to come up with the actual issue was, but that's that kind of very much a kind of mixed identity. You know, they in one sense they might go to voting Tory or Reform, but in another sense it's, you know, they solidly working class in terms of the action they end up having to take to defend their own interests.
Thank you. Still got 4 people.
Right. So firstly, I think what David has described is a very macho phenomenon. The worker is typically a man who's aspirational, self-employed, often building worker, maybe in IT, maybe whatever, but it is a male dominated movement ideologically. It seems to me it's against LGBT rights, trans rights, etc. Identity politics, which don't support identity politics as how can I describe it, as a phenomenon, as a liberal phenomenon, but anybody who is not part of that does not kind of any like migrants, trans people, LGBT people, women. In Ireland, the phenomenon is very conservative, wants to reverse the abortion legislation, wants to reverse many of the more, even more moderate laws that have permitted gay marriage, etc., etc. It is like a plebeian to me, like the main guy in Cork, where I live, and he's actually a national leader of the right movement, Derek Blythe, who lived abroad in Canada, married a Canadian, came back to Ireland and is campaigning against migrants. And he films himself regularly for his TikToks in his van on his way to work. All right, lads, do you know that kind of stuff? So young men, I think, are particularly attracted to it because it seems to reflect them in a way that perhaps they feel the rest of society doesn't. So I think it's very macho. It's reactionary. I'm interested in the role of social media. It seems to me to be that they're able to use it very effectively. In terms of your point about it not necessarily reflecting the most deprived sections, I think this is not scientific, but I often look at the comments, when on social media, and they don't tend to be from very, people who seem to be very deprived. They seem to be a lot of kind of, what I would say, well enough to do, self-employed people who are aspirational, who complain about their sons and daughters not being able to afford to buy houses. They're not looking for social housing, they're looking for individual ownership. And that just brings me to my last point, because I'm aware of the time. Like in Ireland, the big issue is housing. So they're fighting against migrants taking housing. In reality, asylum seekers are living in direct provision, which are overcrowded hotels or tents. So what they're objecting to is not really proper housing being given to people, but just their existence at all. But a number of left groups and campaigns, as Community and Tenants Union, they do a lot of work on campaigning around housing. And I know that you said that we need to fight for these issues, but then also you said, I think, somewhere along the lines that this is not satisfying the demands for clampdowns on migrants and others, doesn't actually deal with the problem. So I would raise the point is that don't we need more of a vision, an international vision? Because like just dealing with the complaints that are made, I'm not sure is going to satisfy. I mean, of course, we need social housing. Of course, we need decent housing, but I'm not sure that that's going to deal with the phenomenon of this movement. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, David. I wasn't wondering whether to come to this session. I'm very pleased that I did. It was very good, and I hope we can get a recording of it afterwards, because I'd like to look at it again. I think we're dealing here with interconnection of class and nation and race and gender. Actually, I'm just reminding me of that point. All of these three things are connected, and the right does. We always think the right is doing nation and race. And you've highlighted how class is so important to them and how they have to define class in a particular way. Because after all, we're in a society where the majority is working class. So every party has got to be a working class party by definition. Even the Tories claimed to be the party of the working class not that long ago, much to everybody's surprise. But here we are in England, and I think that what the left tends to do is to set class against nation and race. We do class, but we just don't do nation and race. Class exists, but perhaps nation and race don't. Now that was strange if you think about, there is a Scottish working class and there is an Irish working class and there's a Welsh working class, but I don't think there's an English working class. Even though E.P. Thompson told us in the making of the English working class, it did exist. And so we haven't. If we want to challenge the far right, we have to get to grips with this idea of nation and race and how we articulate that with the question of class. You know, so I think that sort of follows a little bit from what you're saying. This is a mystery of the non-English working class that doesn't exist. Now, I was in collective, so I said where we're discussing what shall we call the new party. So I said, it's a sort of joke, really. I said, well, I'm going to call it. I propose we call it the Love England, Hate Britain Party. You know, and people say, well, why do you hate Britain? You know, what have you got against Britain? So I said a little bit with flags and empires and the Union and reaction of all sorts and murder and mayhem and all this stuff. But then they challenged this question of this Love England, and the people from Liverpool said, we're not English, we're Scousers, we hate England, the whole idea of England. We've got more in common with the Scots and the Irish and the Welsh. And it's interesting if you think about England, because we've been hearing about Middlesbrough, we've been hearing about Newcastle, etc. We've been hearing about Durham as well, etc. And we were hearing about Liverpool. So there are regional identities that do play a role in where we are, but there isn't a kind of national identity. And national identity, like any other identity, has to be contested. It's not given to you. It's historically given to you, but it's also a site of class struggle. We have to fight over it, which would lead me towards thinking a little bit about France insoumise as having a way of dealing with that. I think I'll end on this point. There's no such thing in my mind. There's an English working class, but there's not a white working class. As those people who speak in England of a white working class are trying to divide the English working class along racial lines, or they are people who are echoing that and promoting it. And the discussion of the white working class has to be countered in some other way. And I think that's what we have to do. We have to get to grips with this question of England and the English working class.
Nationalism. And I was actually going to refer to the problem on the left. I mean, I come from the generation of, not that I was associated with it, but Marxism today, Eric Hobsbawm, let's not talk about class, let's talk about the nation, whatever the hell you want to talk about it, let's contest that. That's Euro-communism for you. And I would actually argue that if you look at New Labour, and we're all middle class, intellectually, you know, glad you're nodding on that one, Neil Kinnock, you know, his favourite Marxist was Eric Hobsbawm. And when I was in the Young Communist League and the official Communist Party, you raised the question of the working class, ha, 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 etc. So they wanted a junk class, you know, that's all old-fashioned stuff. They wanted to take up the nation, and they wanted a popular front. And yeah, you had precisely, the Euro-communists raising Scotland, raising Wales, right? And if you raise Scotland and you raise Wales, then obviously then you raise England. And the idea that that's the road to unity, I just think is barking mad. You know, so I don't think that that's the right way forward. I think it's exactly the wrong way forward. And just, you know, I was looking at the Morning Star article written by Jeremy Corbyn, or under the title of Jeremy Corbyn. No, seriously, because I've been told, I don't know, I've been told by people who get the raw material from Jeremy Corbyn that they have to rewrite it. You know, he's not the greatest writer. Either way, whoever wrote the damned article, what was interesting about it, in terms of his, we're supporting a party, by the way, that isn't like these top-down parties, which I thought was an interesting one, given what it's all being decided up there in secret. This is not top-down. It's not that I disapprove of top-down, but you know, if you're lecturing people, it's not a good idea then to do it. Anyway, in this bottom-up party, apparently there was no mention of class. And I just thought that was slightly significant. Most likely because they didn't think about it. And it does strike me that this is the crucial question. You know, that what actually we need to be on about is not the English working class or the Liverpool working class or the Durham working class or the Welsh working class. We want to be on about the working class, which is international, right? And it's female and it's male and it's skilled and it's unskilled, right? That is the way to actually unite us. It's homosexual and it's straight, it's trans and it's whatever. It's working class, and that's the way forward. And we can win people precisely to that class from the petty bourgeoisie and from the bourgeoisie and the state, precisely on hands. Let's have some bloody vision here. And it's been done in the past. Doesn't mean we want to copy it, but if it can be done in the past, why the hell can't it be done now? So anyway, that was just that one. Lumpen proletariat, Jerry. I mean, you know more about this than I do, David. My understanding of the late 20s, 30s in Germany, a lot of the unemployed voted communist, right? That's my understanding of it. So I'm a bit dubious on, well, they're the lumpen proletariat. I mean, depending on how you define lumpen proletariat. Just last point, really. I was reading Socialist Worker. It's one of my jobs. I have to read. So the worst one, by the way, is the socialist stuff. Oh God, I'm sort of punished. Anyway, Socialist Worker on Essex. All of these people, I agree with you. I mean, I don't know what class they come from, but are they all Nazis? According to Socialist Worker, they're not only fascists, they were Nazis. And I just thought, this is really stupid politics. The socialist was much better. I don't know what they described them as, but basically they said, we need class politics in order to win these people, as opposed to, these people are beyond the pale. That doesn't, I mean, I haven't got an easy answer to it, but certainly if you just dismiss people as Nazi, then you've lost the argument, you've lost the battle.
What you were saying reminded me of Bourdieu's cultural patterns and the reproduction of social privileges, inequalities through generations. And in many ways, you can see that. I was quite ambivalent about the books and work and so on, but now you can see how that is actually quite significant in the way sections of the working class look at the rest, and very true. But I think what is important is in DSA in the US, there is a beginning of criticism, self-criticism of intersectionality, and this whole, the way campaigns were presented as equal to working class struggle or class issues, the reduction of class aspects of struggle when it came to equal rights. And I was talking to some Iranian leftists inside Iran, and the way some of them talk, you think you have many battles. The working class is doing one battle, women are one section, national minorities are another, and how Western intersectionality has now become even worse in those types of scenarios, where inevitably then the working class sees itself devolved, completely separated from this, and then supports Zionism as a result of it. But my question is, how do these right-wing movements, which are not Nazi, I agree, justify their association with Israel and Zionism? That's quite difficult for me to follow. Are they being paid, or is it just natural?
That's covered. So thanks, everyone. Yeah, I'll start actually with the point about Middlesbrough and Durham and Liverpool and Steve's point. which is that I think a very important part of the story told by, say, Reform UK, and a couple of people actually mentioned the idea of like the Red Wall, which I think is an interesting, or is a kind of illustrative example of my point, which is like no one had ever used the expression Red Wall until like 7 or 8 years ago. Like it's a journalistic invention. It's not like an identity that historically belongs to working class people in Britain. But people now talk about it as if it was, including in their own personal identity. Like I looked at the after the Durham Miners Gala, I read the Facebook page of the Durham Miners Gala, like their official one, and they had something about Palestinian visiting. And it's full of comments with people who are like, oh yeah, I'm a Red Wall person and my granddad worked in the mines, and often like talking about this like sort of inherited local class identity, and framed, with the right-wing comments as, why are you talking about Palestine, not like our own people? But then even then, it's not at the level of like, why are you talking about Palestine and not about let's have more, whatever, jobs or council housing? It's literally like, you're talking about suffering in Palestine, but what about my granddad who got black lung? Or what about all the people who died? And that basically their point is the event should have a commemorative character aimed at unredeemed, like past suffering, and then totally lack any kind of redemptive or political quality. It's basically just like a story of victimhood. And I think that's important to the way in which working class identity can be mobilized to reactionary ends, which is to be just a story of not of strength and collectivism, but only reduced to its element of victimhood. So you can say, of course, the injustices and the suffering and the terrible conditions can be part of the reason for mobilization, but particularly given that, given that the miners as a political force are, reduced to a minimum. I don't know if Dave Douglas is here, I'm sure he'd disagree, but like, given that the miners are no longer a solidaristic and upsurging force, then that identity is easily mobilized in a reactionary direction. I think Liverpool is an interesting case in point as well, as a city that is seen as having an ingrained left-wing identity, like you said, like, oh, it's not even English because it's so culturally radical. But of course, like Liverpool until the 50s wasn't that way. Right? Liverpool is a historic centre of religious sectarianism with few parallels in England, and up till the 50s had like liberal councils. So there's been a creation of a left-wing working class identity, but it belongs to a certain historical moment, and there's good reason to believe it will not last forever. So those kind of, and we've even seen, it's also true. I mean, Ed Mustill wrote a very good critique of the kind of Northern Independence Party idea, which is, well, actually, these like regional identities, it's true, as Steve says, that they're a battleground, but and that also means they can, there's a kind of like local particularism, this kind of like, oh, like not down in that London type identity politics where you have like like there's a thing called the Yorkshire Party, these kind of things which are like actually divide the idea of like of common working class interest by instead creating a particularist and regional one. From what Ian said, I guess I was also interested to ask, you talked about two areas. One is Seaham Enterprise Parks as against like the ghost town Easington. I wondered actually if there's a difference in the way they vote, because it seems
not particularly as well as Seaham, but I think Easington still has Labour MP.
Okay, well that's interesting, because I think like, yes, so it's because also it's you said as well, Ian, the thing about the NHS being the biggest employer in Sunderland, was it?
Well, it's right up in the northeast.
Oh yeah, okay.
Certainly in Durham. and I think the NHS is probably bigger even in this sense. This sense. In the context of Durham City itself, isn't actually well, because you've got not only HMB Durham, but HMB Franklin. Franklin interestingly was developed and
Yeah, because when you mentioned that, it reminded me of there's a US scholar called Gabriel Winant, and he has this interesting point, which is about it's easy to think of like the Rust Belt ex-mining areas in terms of abandonment, and in terms of there used to be a mining community, but now the same people who were linked to mining jobs but now might be pensioners are voting for Trump. But his point is actually, well, the thing is the important thing to study is, or to understand, is how the class composition of those areas has changed. Because it's not just, oh, there used to be industry and now there is nothing, but rather actually that the welfare state, the US welfare state, and like Medicare is central to the economy of those areas. And so, the Trump voter might actually succeed. So the Trump vote might actually grow among people who are welfare recipients, who are pensioners receiving Medicare, and who they want to preserve it for themselves, but not for others. So, it depends on the context, of course. Then Bob's point about Spain. I mean, I think that the interesting thing with Vox in Spain is that even compared to, say, National Rally in France, Vox is particularly open about it, as I understand it. Vox is particularly open about its straightforwardly right-wing economic agenda. It's not harking back to some past era of social democracy or welfareism. I mean, it has an aristocratic leadership, has many of the sort of stuff of Francoism and monarchy. It's not like, oh, it has right-wing identity politics and also left-wing economics. I think that kind of framing is and as you said, it's that among certain parts of the working class, a very kind of entrepreneurial, acquisitive type of idea, the idea that like the rich benefactor will help us, this kind of stuff, really takes root. And in the case of the Spanish government, which is relatively so among European social democratic governments, of which there are very few, it's among it can be said to be the more redistributive. And Yolanda Diaz, her Sumar party, their idea was, well, we don't have we don't have local organizations, we don't have a social structure behind it, but from government we're going to show that the left can govern, that we can carry out important reforms, that we can cap energy prices, raise the minimum wage, change the labor law, and they did, right? And they did better than expected in the last general election. But now that they've had fully 2 years where the Socialist Workers' Party, well, the Spanish thing that's called the Socialist Workers' Party, the Spanish centre-left and Sumar, plus Catalan nationalists and all that, might have a formal majority in parliament. But basically, they've done nothing since the election. They haven't passed a budget. The Catalan nationalists are broadly right-wing and blocked everything. So now Sumar finds itself as a left-wing party in government that hasn't passed any legislation for 2 years. It was relying on this idea of this like left-wing version of technocracy and giving people nice reforms from above, and now its support has plummeted. Like they're on 5 or 6% of the vote, as far as I understand. So the thing is that it mightn't be that left-wing voters are directly switching to Vox, but then if the left-wing base is demobilized, has nothing to fight for and achieve, isn't given that leadership, then it's not going to be able to compete with the far right. On Mike's points, yeah, I mean, it's certainly the case that this kind of like anti-liberalism, this anti-elitism isn't new. And there's always been parts of there's always been right-wing movements that mobilized around the idea of the industrial, meritorious against those who aren't. I mean, it seems to me though that what's changed is the lack of competition from a rival galvanizing project of like left-wing working class politics. So instead we have this sort of petty dispute between different groups, like you said, claiming that other people are being subsidized, whereas they are not. But then, I think that's difficult to politicize in a positive way. People like telling people that they are indeed beneficiaries of state subsidies and so on. Like I think of the example of when Barack Obama said something like, "Oh well, no one is a self-made man." I think he didn't actually use that exact expression, but basically he said no one has dragged themselves up from their bootstraps. Everyone relies on society. And I think the at the level of like building a political movement based on different parts of the working class in the same movement for a socialist end goal, then that can convey that sense of society, of collective and overlapping interest. I think it is important for the left, not to say, well, it's the workers who create all wealth or this kind of thing, but yes, to show the social value of work and the fact that that's not limited to industrial labor. But I think that if we imagine a kind of isolated individual or tradesman faced with their condition and perhaps thinking about their political choices in terms of tax pressure and this kind of thing, then it's very easy for them to see themselves in an individualized way, even if they also think about themselves as being working class. This kind of connects to the issue raised by both Yasmin and Tina about Yasmin and Anne about housing. There's a recent book by Thomas Piketty, the French economist, where he says, well, the problem is that large parts of the working class associate with like home ownership as a value, as an aspiration. In fact, and when I referred earlier to like basically faced with the riots last year, Mel Stride, the historian, he said, well, home ownership, access to home ownership, that's the thing that will break people out of social alienation. So I think it was interesting that he politicized, it was like faced with the rioting against migrant hotels and mosques, you say, well, the problem is social need, and then the way that that is to be addressed, or what's assumed to be the natural solution, is like the Thatcherite one, like create a nation of homeowners. But obviously the fact of the right to buy and the decades since is that there is that lots of people do express the desire for autonomy through the lens of home ownership and not wanting to live in social housing. And that differs from country to country and depending on how good the social housing is. But Piketty in his book actually argues that home ownership has become so central to working class expectation that actually the left should create a social movement in favor of access to home ownership of a type, he says, with the historic movement for like the welfare state and hospitals and so on. So I think that that's very unconvincing as an argument in terms of like I find it hard to imagine what form such a movement could take. And actually like looking at the Irish case where like housing is clearly a central political issue, and in Ireland there's been these referendums about same-sex marriage and abortion, and so people are like, oh, let's have a referendum on housing. It's like, well, what would that look like? Like, what does that mean? So I think that the problem is that it's certainly difficult to imagine a socialist movement or a communist party that puts at its center of its aims home ownership. But then there is within that a kind of aspiration for autonomy, very tied up with people's cultural expectations, which I think is difficult for us to respond to and talk about. If people expect that that's their model of success or aspiration, that's surely difficult to respond to. Then
I'll finish on Tina. Yeah, I mean, I think the you know, all of this stuff about like, oh, online voting and pure democracy because, oh, well, you know, if we vote online, then that makes it easier for people who would struggle to come to a meeting or don't have enough time and so on. And, you know, that is a problem, right? We don't want like a direct democracy that's the dictatorship of people who are always available, people who are, you know, people who are have endless time on their hands. We don't want a party also that's too oriented, you know, that's too dominated by, you know, students or whatever. But at the same time, the kind of model of online democracy has already been tested to destruction by the examples we've seen already. If you think of, like, say, the 5-star movement in Italy, or France Insoumise, or Podemos in Spain had it for a bit, right? It's like you have a very small, basically you have a tiny group at the center who always decide what the framing of the question will be, typically minor and symbolic issues to give people a sense of a say. And then, you know, people get to occasionally vent by voting an online referendum. And, you know, I think it's, you know, the problem isn't whether it's top down, but that even a, you know, party is obviously going to be structured by the top down. The question is whether it reaches to the bottom, whether it has the structures at the local and territorial level that will allow masses of people to really participate, take ownership of it, and actually create something that will last and won't, you know, splinter over every little issue or collapse as soon as Jeremy Corbyn loses interest. Yeah, so I'll stop.
Thank you very much. Sorry, can we do that afterwards? We've got a tribute now. Pam, if you're going to quickly lead us. Yeah. Oh, sorry. This one has to be my okay, Michael, can you unmute?
Just to leave in 10 minutes, so we have to swap. Yeah. We can.
Do you not want to introduce what we're doing? Do you not want to introduce what we're doing? Yeah.
Yes, I think agreed we would have a tribute to bringing up presidents who was not many of us looking on anything out here. Some of it on the head of the family who were actually on the call. It was a very big amount of very little understanding of all the changes. We went to many demonstrations and the clarity and fair law and all of the people outside. I first met her at the store years ago. I was introduced to her by